Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because it truly feels like we're finally approaching the finish line on this Bitcoin correction. And unfortunately, I'm just now seeing a lot of investors beginning to give up and throw in the towel because of how painful and boring this summer chop has been, especially for the investors that weren't familiar with Bitcoin's summer seasonality and were heavily allocated to riskier altcoins. But of course, we knew there was a high likelihood of this prolonged reaccumulation phase happening because of how euphoric and how excited the market was after that post-ETF launch rally from January to March of this year. And it really felt like the market had gotten ahead of itself and was expecting us to just continue higher and go to 100K immediately. And it made way more sense for the supply to change hands and for Bitcoin to build a large base and build some consolidation and structure before we could really have the strength for the next move higher. And of course, now that Bitcoin has finally hit our minimum downside target and it has seen a correction of over 30%, I'm open to the low being in. Of course, I would love to see us revisit the low 40Ks, not only because that was our previous consolidation, but it's also the yearly open for 2024. And it's also the price range where the ETFs went live. So having the conviction of all of those ETF buyers getting tested one last time before the major move higher would make a lot of sense to me, but I know it's not anywhere near guaranteed, and I do think we've seen enough of a sentiment reset for the low to be in. But of course, as always, we're open to multiple scenarios on this channel, and I would not be surprised if we see the low 40Ks before Bitcoin's next move higher. And that's why I've updated the drawing for this normal cycle scenario. Maybe we see one last flush out, especially with all the uncertainty going into the election, or perhaps the low is already behind us and we can just see some sideways price action for the rest of the summer and pick up later in the year. It's hard to know for sure, but I do think this correction is pretty close to being finished, especially with how choppy and painful this summer price action has been and how many people have given up hope and lost money, even though Bitcoin has essentially been going sideways for 6 months. Now, I also want to address why I don't think the macro top is in, especially with the price structure we've seen, and I don't think enough people are talking about this. Bitcoin is heavily driven by liquidity because the market makers do whatever they want with price to gather as much liquidity as possible. And you'll notice that Bitcoin's major tops always have a higher high structure and a higher low structure because that's what baits in the most leveraged longs and the most FOMO buyers, because every single time Bitcoin puts in a high, everybody FOMOs in expecting higher prices, and then you see a flush in price and everybody starts to panic. But then as soon as Bitcoin puts in a new high, everybody piles back into the market and expects it to go higher, and then they flush that leverage again, and then you tend to see a third time. Sometimes it's only two, sometimes it's three, and that'll be the major massive liquidity pull where everybody piles in with leverage and with FOMO buying. And of course, this is when you see euphoria all over social media. And then of course, the rug ends up getting pulled. Same thing in November of 2021. We had that one major wick to the upside above those previous highs. Everybody was expecting breakout. Everybody was expecting much higher. And of course, price dropped like 15% immediately and liquidated a lot of that leverage. And then we got one last push to the upside, taking out that high once again, making everybody FOMO in at the top with both spot buying and leverage. And then of course the rug gets pulled. And then we saw the same thing again in 2022 with the higher highs and higher lows over here. You take out that last high, make everybody pile into the breakout, and then pull the rug once again. So for me, I'm usually a lot more concerned when I'm seeing higher highs and higher lows for Bitcoin on those very condensed timeframes. But what we've been seeing so far this bull market is very, very different. We've been seeing lower highs and lower lows that end up breaking upward. Same thing over here, lower highs, lower lows. Here we put in that lower low and then we took off. And what we've seen recently doesn't look like a lot of liquidity being grabbed to the upside so we can just nuke to the downside. It looks like a lot of longs are getting baited at the tops, a lot of shorts are getting baited at the bottom, but Bitcoin is just consolidating and a lot of the supply is changing hands. And it feels a lot more likely to me that eventually this is going to break upwards and take all this liquidity up here and all of the people that are going to be shorting this market all the way down in one fell swoop once we get that breakout to the upside. And that's why I think it's very unlikely this has been a macro top. The sell-off is just way too systematic. It's way too clean and symmetrical. And it looks like Bitcoin is just building a reaccumulation base for the next move higher, while of course everybody is just getting taken for a narrative roller coaster back and forth between bearish and bullish with every single drop and bounce. For example, in the past 24 hours, I'm seeing all this excitement that TradFi firms have positions in BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF, but a lot of it is hedge funds. So maybe they're buying the ETF, but hedging it by shorting Bitcoin and just bringing in money on the carry trade because they're getting paid to short, but holding the spot to protect their upside in case Bitcoin rallies. And then of course, we're still seeing drama around Mt. Gox moving Bitcoin. I can't wait for this narrative to be behind us because it definitely feels overhyped in my opinion. But of course, it's all part of that narrative roller coaster. And of course, we're seeing this being spread all over the place, that Marathon Digital, one of the biggest US miners, if not the biggest after Riot, is buying Bitcoin instead of only mining it. And they're taking on a full hodl approach, which of course is making the market very excited because miners are one of the biggest sellers of Bitcoin, of course, as they produce it. So one of the largest ones buying and hodling Bitcoin is, I guess, bullish as a standalone narrative. But of course, everybody forgot about that once the US government moved 10,000 Bitcoin, and we have no idea when they're going to sell it or if they're going to sell it, but it's very likely they do. And of course, they still hold 200,000 Bitcoin, which is pretty crazy. And who knows at what rate they're going to sell it? Are they going to hold it? But it's definitely a very convenient narrative for the market to latch onto every single time that the wallet moves any Bitcoin. And of course, this is what I talked about in depth in my last video. You just have this narrative from bearish, bullish, and there's a narrative for both sides. If you're a perma-bull, you can find infinite things to talk about for your bias. If you're a perma-bear, you can always find something to talk about for your bias. But what I like to focus on is potential scenarios that are a little bit more zoomed out and where I think we are in the cycle. And I definitely think we're getting towards the end of a reaccumulation phase with perhaps a couple more shakeouts because of all the volatility we're expecting going into the election, because historically we've seen volatility increase from July to November in election years. And of course, this is for the S&P 500, but we know the S&P 500 has a big impact on Bitcoin because the S&P 500, although it had a sell-off recently and has seen a nice bounce so far, it's very correlated to Bitcoin historically because Bitcoin is further out on the risk curve. So if the S&P 500 is doing incredibly well, maybe TradFi institutions and larger capital holders will start to speculate more on things like Bitcoin. But if the S&P 500 isn't doing well, it becomes a lot less likely to justify going out on the risk curve and buying Bitcoin. And that's why these are so correlated. And a lot of times Bitcoin just trades like a leveraged S&P 500 because they're both so driven by liquidity. But Bitcoin, of course, has a lot more volatility in both directions. And speaking of volatility in both directions, we're about a month away from the first rate cut from the Federal Reserve, and I expect a lot of narratives and a lot of volatility going into that meeting, the month leading up to it starting in 2 days, and of course the month after it as these expectations change based on labor data and inflation data. And although I know people love to say that rate cuts are bad for the market, I don't think that's true because I think there's other variables at play. For example, the deficit spending we've been seeing from the US government that I try to cover as often as possible, because if we just looked at what the Fed was doing in a vacuum, I mean, we should already be 1 year into a recession now, and risk assets should be significantly lower because of how long the Fed has kept these rates elevated. But because the federal government and the Treasury are essentially counteracting what the Fed is doing, we've seen the incredible performance in risk assets that we've seen over the past year and a half or so. So although I know that this is going to make a lot of people panic and think that rate cuts have to mean market crash, I just don't think it's that simple. And I think there's other variables to watch as well. And I think now that we're seeing this weakening labor data and we're seeing this inflation slowly start to work its way down while the federal government is still running those deficits, I think it's very hard to see this major crash scenario in the short term that so many people are expecting by comparing what happened in 2008 and what happened in the dot-com bubble. Because if we look at the history of the federal deficit, you'll see that we're already spending way, way more than we were to pull the economy out of a recession in 2008 or after the dot-com bubble. So to me, it feels like the federal government is front-running the recession and getting ahead of it and kicking the can down the road, because this deficit is way larger than what the government did during those previous recessions to pull the economy out of it. So for now, we're going to have to wait and see. We really want to see Bitcoin reclaim 61.5K and get back above the range that we fell below. This range has kind of been hilarious because at first, when we first hit 74K and came and bounced off the bottom of the range, everybody was like, see, it's just a bounce. The market is never going below 60K. It's so bullish. And then of course we fell below the bottom of the range. And then everybody was saying, oh, it was just a wick. It's not a big deal. We're still bullish. That was your last chance to buy below 60K. And then of course we went even deeper below the range in July, and everybody said, oh wait, never mind. Look, it was a quick reclaim. Nothing to worry about here. That was your last chance to buy below 60K. And then of course, the most recent time we went way below that level and then even came up and bearishly retested the lower side, which of course didn't happen the last 2 times we broke below this range. So I think it's just a time to still be patient. We are getting close to the finish line, in my opinion, as I said, but there's no reason to get incredibly excited immediately and think that Bitcoin is just going to teleport from here because, you know, we had this big bounce off of 50K, because we've seen those wicks the entire way down as the market gets excited and buys after each and every bounce. As for the dollar index, still not doing much. I mean, it's kind of working its way down, but it's still within this huge range. And I don't think the market is really going to care about what the dollar index is doing until we get below 100 or above 106.50. For now, it's just kind of going sideways. But if we do see the Fed start to cut rates aggressively while the federal government is still having these huge deficits, maybe we could see that have some real downward impact on the US dollar, which of course is what we want to see for those Bitcoin mania phases. And it's why I've been relatively conservative recently, because yes, we've seen the dollar index go down, but it's still in this side range. It's still in the sideways range, and it's nothing like what we've seen in those previous Bitcoin mania phases. And of course, that's why I've been very hesitant to go out on the risk curve and buy altcoins. I've been told that alt season is around the corner hundreds of times, but of course, we've just seen altcoins underperform Bitcoin for the past few months because the conditions just aren't quite there for alt season to actually start. And Bitcoin is still in the middle of this fair value range, in my opinion. Not the best price to buy, but also not terrible. Again, I would love to get one more chance to buy in the undervalued region in that low 40K area. And it's nice to see that we got a very quick bounce the last time we slightly dipped into that undervalued region. But I don't know if it's guaranteed or we're going to get a chance to rebuy at those levels. I would love to take advantage of it if we do, but no idea if we're going to get a chance to buy there again. And of course, a lot of this is short to medium term stuff, with this reaccumulation phase finally being close to finishing. But in the long term, I'm still incredibly bullish on Bitcoin, and I still think this is just one prolonged consolidation in the yellow box, like we've seen in previous cycles, before the real party can begin. So we have to be patient and try to lose as little money as possible until that opportunity actually comes. And of course, we're bullish on Bitcoin in the long term, just like we're bullish on the S&P 500, because the denominator is getting devalued exponentially. And it's a trend that I don't think is changing anytime soon. And if anything, based on what we're seeing from the federal government and their deficits before we even fully enter recession, I think this trend is only going to accelerate over the next few years, which of course is bullish for our risk assets in the longer term. But anyway, let me know what you expect. Have you given up hope on this correction? Do you think the macro top is in, or are you being patient and accumulating at these prices because you have decently high conviction that Bitcoin is eventually going to break higher? Would love to know what you guys expect. Thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.